Hey everybody, welcome back to another Reasonable Price Prediction, the series where we try to figure out where your favorite altcoins could be headed. Now today we are looking at Litecoin, and it's about time because it's been well over a month since we last looked at Litecoin, and a lot of stuff has happened with LTC in that time frame. In the last video we sort of focused a lot on this idea that Litecoin was putting in, or likely to put in, a retracement as we got further and further out from the halving. So we can see here we went 2 weeks, this next time we went 6 weeks, or 8 weeks in total, and then the next one was an extra 12 weeks on top of that. Obviously this hasn't played out, as if we zoom into the chart, yeah, we had a bit of a pullback, and on that week that we actually predicted, we did have a very strong move to the downside. Quite a strong move. I mean, if we actually take a look, we did get a move of basically a 25% drop. So you could argue that that's a victory. Me personally not. I did say that I was expecting a much harsher drop basically, and I made that quite clear in the video, so I'm not going to take credit for that. Although that the fact that we did have a very strong move down on that week probably does indicate some kind of validity, maybe, to that theory. And we basically got this 12 weeks of adding 2 onto the difference of every time we moved up. So the difference here was 4. So the difference here was 4 plus 6 again, which is 4 plus 2, which was 6, so 12. So the next cycle it'll be plus 8. But again, that's, we can focus on that maybe in like 3.5 years when we're closer to the time. So today I basically want to just say that that theory didn't really play out and just talk about what we could see over the next few weeks. Now I am still in the sort of a camp that we will see some sort of a move down. And that basically just comes from the fact that these last few halvings, our first one that Litecoin went through, and the previous one that Litecoin went through, we had a bit of a pull down, whether it was immediately before or a few weeks before. There was some sort of a move down. And now you could argue COVID caused this. Well, of course COVID caused this, but I do feel like there probably would have been and also a move down to the same degree. If we take a look at what we experienced previously, we sort of experienced a 40% drop over a month or so. And if we go back to here, we experienced basically a 40% drop in a week. So for me to get the 20% drop was a bit of not what I expected. But again, I'm not trying to make excuses, but we do talk about how, one of the big things that appeals to me about Litecoin is that its volatility has reduced a lot over the years. So potentially this could be a factor where as time goes on, Litecoin moves less, it stays within a tighter range as the cycles go on. We spoke about this a lot in the last video, how basically we haven't even entered into this deeper value range that I set out a long time ago. We haven't even entered into that this cycle and are very likely not to. And we've kind of also put in similar levels for the highs that we visited in the 2021 bull market. So we are kind of slowly shrinking the range. Also in terms of how widely we move over a period of time has also been reduced. We can see we have a slower climb up and a slower climb down compared to the last cycle. And again, with this move here, much slower. And then the pullback, also much slower and less harsh over a longer time frame. So again, this could potentially be a factor, this 20% move down instead of maybe a 35% move like we would have expected. Just something to think about, maybe. But in terms of what we could see over the next few weeks, last 2 halvings, like I was saying, Litecoin has usually trended up into them. And I drew a line here that is completely fictional, but maybe what we could have seen if COVID hadn't happened, something along this line where maybe Litecoin rallied up and stayed somewhere below this line at most times, maybe, before eventually breaking out. But of course that is fictional, so I'm going to kind of mainly rely on what we saw last time, and that was over the space of give or take 18 weeks, Litecoin went up steadily, but not much. And if we take kind of from this low here to where we are now, we've currently gone 24 weeks, so potentially a longer time frame. You can make an argument about where you want to take this sort of measurement from. Again, where I took it from, you could argue here would be the best place, or maybe even here. I'm going to take it where I think sort of this white starts, and again, it's about a 100% move up over 20 weeks. If we take it where I started this white move here, it's a much longer time. And I'm even going to be a bit generous. I'm going to put it on the low, which is after the white, and that brings us to 24 weeks and a much smaller move in percentage terms. So already there's like this reduced volatility does seem to be playing out in all aspects of Litecoin. We've gone on for a longer time and we've moved less during that time. And for me, I think this is a bullish thing. I think a lot of cryptos want to become some sort of a currency. They want to have some sort of a stable value. And I think Litecoin is one of the very few cryptos that can have this, aside from a coin that's just dead and like it's trading at 0.00000001 and then between a range of 0.00000002. Litecoin is actually, it's a well-established cryptocurrency. It has a decent level of utility. The network is fast enough, it's decentralized enough, and its price doesn't fluctuate hugely. You can't say that about Bitcoin. Bitcoin's very decentralized. Transaction speed isn't amazing, but neither is Litecoin's. But Bitcoin's price ranges hugely. I mean, you know, even this cycle, Bitcoin has done a 5x upwards. Now that's a good thing if you bought Bitcoin, you know, a year ago. But for someone who maybe wants to have a more stable asset that they can just hold and maybe it appreciates a small bit, basically a gold that can be used to transact with, Litecoin is a very appealing in that sense, because again, its volatility seems to be reducing and reducing. And after this halving, God knows where Litecoin goes. Where does it put in its low? Is this potentially where it will put in its low next cycle? On the Bitcoin pair, I mean, it does seem to be somewhere around the halfway mark between the halvings, maybe just a little bit afterwards, that Litecoin does put in its low. So we saw a low here, which was about more or less 2 years later, 2 and 5 months later. We saw here our low. This was basically bang on 2 years later. So again, somewhere around the halfway mark, Litecoin puts in its low, excusing the low that it went into at the beginning of the year. Maybe by 2026, you know, June, July time, Litecoin will be putting in a low. Maybe it's the low that it enters it in at the start of the year. And currently Litecoin is headed to cross the halving at above $80. Now, there could obviously be pullbacks, but I don't expect Litecoin to not cross the halving below $70. I think Litecoin will be trading above $70 on the day of the halving, most likely. But of course, I don't know for sure. That's just an educated guess. We are in a slow uptrend here, like we can see. Litecoin could very easily break to the downside, but ultimately with how the crypto space is currently, Litecoin does seem like it will be okay. But of course, I don't have a crystal ball. But that's kind of all I want to say about the US dollar chart, because I think the Bitcoin chart for Litecoin is much more interesting, and it's actually something we kind of got right. And if we kind of take a look at it, I know there seems to be a lot going on, but ultimately what it says is Litecoin is losing value against Bitcoin. As cycles go on, Litecoin is putting in lower lows and lower highs, realistically. As time goes on, it's kind of just lower highs, and you could basically draw a line all the way down here to sort of mark your lower highs. That's not me trying to dunk on Litecoin. That's actually in a way a compliment, because again, I did talk about how Litecoin is less volatile than Bitcoin, and if it goes in this way of a more stable currency, I think that's a very bullish thing for crypto, because it would essentially be a truly decentralized stable coin, even though it wouldn't really be a stable coin. But to be honest with you, I don't think a lot of people care about that. I think they just care about gains. And to be fair, if you're watching this video, that's probably why you're here. So I'm going to stop talking about it. The first thing to take note of is these orange lines are the halving, and we can see Litecoin has been through multiple cycles. It's about to close out its third. And what we see with Litecoin is that usually when it's tending towards the halving, it's at a low for that cycle. It's either close to the low or it's basically at that low. And this first cycle, we can see Litecoin basically immediately after it passed the halving went in and put in an all-time low on its Bitcoin pair. And then at the end of that cycle, it was very close to that all-time low. It put in a low of 3,000 Satoshis. And then at the end of the year, it was at basically 4,500 Satoshis. Sorry, I keep saying year. End of the cycle, it was at 4,500 Satoshis. So a bit above, but ultimately quite close. And then not too long after that, it basically came down to these levels. And this was at the start of the 2021 Bullrun. So it had a bit of a revival, but then basically came down lower. And then now where we currently are, Litecoin has actually broken below the support that we basically had mapped out from kind of, you know, the start of 2023 before, or at least I know I wasn't making videos, but this chart had existed for a long time. For me, Litecoin broke below basically where I expected it would bottom out. And that was just basically based on the percentage moves that Litecoin makes down as the cycles go on. So we can see roughly Litecoin moves 50% down from its previous cycle low to the next cycle low. And we can see that here is basically 50%, here is 53%. So I took a kind of average guess to predict where we could see our low next cycle. And then the same for how far we drop from our high. So Litecoin puts in a high at 50,000 Satoshis. It then drops 50% and puts in a high of 25,000 Satoshis next cycle. And then the cycle after that, we put in a high of 7,500 Satoshis. So again, down way more, 70%. So for the next cycle, I just took a rough average, slap bang in the middle, down 60% from what we could expect. And what you'll notice is these ranges are slowly shrinking, again, suggesting a less volatile cryptocurrency. And what do we also notice again? During the and around the halving time, Litecoin trades down into the halving, and it trades down after the halving as well. And this is for a long period of time too, before we see any kind of decent reversion. And this is what this orange arrow indicates. This indicates how long Litecoin falls and how far Litecoin falls, without getting a real trend reversal. So without seeing a real breakout to the upside. So here, this first cycle, going into the second cycle, Litecoin trades down 80% from its weekly close at a high down to this low, where we finally get a trend reversal and we basically have a bull run. So it goes down 83%. Here, Litecoin at this high from April of 2019, where we had a small little bull run, which a lot of people are comparing this bull run to, and I think is actually accurate because monetary policy is basically the same in the United States. We're still in QT. We haven't had any basis point reductions yet. Interest is still high. So the same kind of environment. Litecoin has a pump up and then it drops 81% basically until it gets an actual trend reversal. Now you could argue here that we got a trend reversal here, and you wouldn't be too wrong, because if you zoom in, you do actually basically get 4, 5, 6 weeks of good price action, 7 really. So over the space of 2.5 months, you get basically 2 months, just under 2 months of good price action. That is kind of a trend reversal. However, basically it's just a bear flag, in my opinion, and we ultimately do trend down until we put in this low, where we then make a move of 100% to the upside, which is very clearly a break in trend. If you're moving 100% to the upside, I would argue you're breaking a trend. So that's where I measured that to, and that's also about 81.5% of a move down. Now, if we move into where we are currently, we're taking this high from before, from the end of 2022, start of 2023. This is where Bitcoin really started to take off. This is where it's basically done a 5x from, give or take, or a 4x, whatever. And we see how much of a move down 80% looks like, because so far we've averaged roughly 80%, 82% really, or a little bit over 82. But just to keep things simple, I'm putting it around 82. Again, this is an estimate. It's not guaranteed what's going to happen. But if we see where it could end up, that would put Litecoin at 800 sats by the time we see a reversion. And maybe that would happen sometime around the end of this year or the start of the next year, again, when the bull run starts. And interestingly enough, we do actually see a reversion a few months, kind of end of Q1 of the bull run year. So 2021, 3 months later, we're in March. That's when we have our reversion. That's when we move up. 2017, 3 months later, we're in March. We get our reversion bull run. So potentially, if things still want to play out in the kind of in the 4-year cycle way that Bitcoin has previously dictated, you would argue that maybe 2025, March, is when Litecoin will most likely bottom out, if it's going to play out the same way it has before. And that gives Litecoin basically a year, just over a year, to drop 50% on its Bitcoin pair. And what it's done historically, during this time frame from the halving, 50% of a drop isn't unheard of. Now, last cycle it only went down 30%, but ultimately went down much lower as time went on. We had a trend reversal, but the coin still ultimately fell. During the we had a 50% drop bang on, which is interesting because we could be seeing something like this play out exactly. Now, again, nothing has to play out the same, and this is all a lot of speculation based on historical events, and there is no guarantee that it does play out in a similar way. But having a cryptocurrency that's been around this long and that we haven't so much data on, like Litecoin, it's very easy to maybe see reoccurring themes at certain stages of the cycle for Litecoin. And also you'll notice a 50% drop would just put us to this low. Litecoin has put in lows, at the start of its cycle, basically. And that's why I do like to compare it to this one, because it'd be a similar move in percentage terms down. Again, like we've already seen, they're 80%, 80%, 80%. It'll be a similar move from the halving. 50% there here, 50% on the way down, 50% on the way down from the halving. And also, it would be a similar time frame as where we touched our low, potentially in this cycle as well. So we might not even go down to this lower band of 500 Satoshis. We might just wick the top and hit the 700 Satoshis. At this point, we're at such a low level of Satoshis, I don't think it really matters. A couple hundred Satoshis, if we're out by. We're ultimately guessing that Litecoin is going to bleed against Bitcoin. So whether it's by a 500 Satoshi drop from our current price of 1300 Satoshis, or whether it's a 700 drop in Satoshis, ultimately you're dropping a lot of Satoshis, and it's going to be somewhere like around the 40% mark, at least, if you have any sort of faith or you think or agree with kind of anything that it has done in the past. So to me, this is like a really interesting chart to look at, and especially comparing this current cycle that we're finishing up to the first cycle Litecoin experienced. It is interesting that have had very similar moves in and about this time. And even if you kind of take a look at the nitty gritties about what happened to Litecoin before we put in this high, we trended down, we had a little fake out a couple months before, and then a slow trend down, almost like a heel of a shoe, if you can see it. If you can see like the leg, and then the heel, and then like the shoe, if you will. We kind of get a bit of that here, not to the same degree, where Litecoin before traded down, it kind of held its ground a little bit last cycle, but there's just a few similarities where we have sudden drops and then like spikes back up at similar times, basically, and then rallies up. Again, we rallied up more slowly and consistently into this high, whereas before we just went there in a few weeks after trading down a little bit lower. But now we're basically at all-time low territory for Litecoin on its Bitcoin pair. And for me, I don't see that really slowing down, because again, Bitcoin is steamrolling. And even if Bitcoin's price tanks now, you can bet your bottom dollar that it's going to be outperforming a lot of altcoins in terms of how far they fall. Like if we look at a lot of altcoins, even like Ethereum hasn't been performing well. The big dogs, like at the end of last year, like Solana and Avalanche, they haven't really moved up that much compared to what Bitcoin has done in the last month or two. You know, Solana's made like actually today I think it made a good move. I think it did like a 5%. But over the last month or so, Solana's been standing by the sidelines, not really putting in much of a move up, while Bitcoin is basically at its all-time high. Same with Ethereum, same with Avalanche. So what I'm trying to say is basically, if you're holding Litecoin, maybe you want to move it into Bitcoin for a small amount of time, for a couple of months, maybe to weather out this storm a bit. There is a good chance that Litecoin trends up on its US dollar pair. So you would ultimately be making money, but if you're holding it in Bitcoin, you might be making more money. If you're not really in it for the money and you want a more stable currency, Litecoin is probably your bet. It does seem to be trending in a stable way, but I doubt very much that many of you will be interested in that, realistically. What to expect from Litecoin in the future? Again, me personally, I think we will probably see a move like this where we put our low in very early on and then ultimately kind of trade above where we enter in at the halving. So once we cross this halving at whatever price we are, I think we will probably stay above or at least in and around that price. And the way Litecoin's going, we could be looking at crossing the halving at somewhere around 1,100 Satoshis, and with an expected kind of high that cycle at about 3,000 Satoshis, it gives Litecoin the kind of room to do a 2x against Bitcoin from sort of the middle ground that we'd be posting at. And if Litecoin trades down to its low, which potentially I don't think we could see until maybe the end of the cycle. Again, we might see it earlier, but I think we'll probably put in a low here in the next few months, within a year, and then we probably won't come back down to that level until we're at the halving. And even then we might not even come down to that low. We might just come close to it. So really this is kind of a bullish sentiment in a way for Litecoin in the long term, because I think after a year, Litecoin's only really going to move up for about 2 years on its Bitcoin pair. But that's just what I think. Feel free to completely disagree with me in the comments below. You guys have been doing a great job of pointing out things that I've missed or updates that are coming down the road. And again, the reason I don't go into that in my videos is I like to focus completely on price, things that have happened. And I find when events are coming up and things like this, it's very hard to measure price-wise what that does for any altcoin. So I oftentimes leave it out. But let me know you know, what's happening with Litecoin. Not only would I be interested, but probably others in the comments as well would be interested in what's coming up. So thanks very much for watching, guys. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. Take care and peace.